welcome to Liberty and Logos, episode 3. In this one, we are hoping to tie off the ends of this long opening discussion we've had of laying out the big picture of who we are, why we're here, how we see the state of things, and where we see opportunities for a large-scale strategy for change. So I wanted to start by just kind of tying off the pan-secession discussion, because after we finished talking a couple days ago, both you and I had been talking about the fact that we can easily anticipate where some of the criticisms and concerns are going to come from advocating this kind of position. And what I have found is when talking to people on the far left, the radical left, if one, at least in the current state of things, if one puts forward the idea of pan-secessionism, there are these kind of boilerplate concerns, criticisms, or even denunciations that usually come forward very quickly. And one of those is, oh, okay, you are for pan-secession, so you want to cordon off humanity into these little pockets, and inevitably some of those pockets will be predicated on cultural or ethnic or religious or I guess those ones mainly homogeneity. Inevitably you're going to get that, and therefore you are some kind of closeted or crypto ethno-nationalist, or you must hate non-heterosexual people, or you must secretly, want to preserve some kind of Christian identity, or, any sort of thing. Basically, you must be some kind of reactionary is where it comes from. The mere fact that you're advocating this means there must be some kind of ulterior motive. You're not actually for human liberation, right?
Yeah.
Anything you to add to that?
Well, just that I think it's primarily a feature of the heterogeneity of this particular milieu that you're talking about amongst contemporary anarchist circles, whereby any kind of non-towing of the main party line is seen as reactionary. Like this, it's almost like there's no room for debate whatsoever. And I myself have received, I don't know how many accusations of being a reactionary, so that would be the starting point, I think, to look at this.
Yeah, it's an odd thing in the I can't speak to outside of the United States, but I suspect it is the case outside the United States in at least some cases as well. But in the American anarchist milieu, I mean, I am the sort of person who will talk about my ideas in a pretty frank manner anywhere I go if the subject comes up, or sometimes even if it doesn't. So, if I'm at a bar or doing my grocery shopping, or whatever, I'm in school, and when you start talking very radically about anarchism or libertarianism or secessionism, any of these things, whether you use that kind of explicit language or not, it does happen every so often that a sort of normie person gets very alarmed and reacts very badly, sees you as some sort of extremist. But it's pretty rare. Most normie people, even if they don't agree, they're just kind of like, huh, okay, that's interesting that you're putting it out there. Whereas when you are in the American anarchist milieu, you have to really be on your toes. I mean, the chances of someone reacting badly and immediately denouncing you or being frightened or disturbed or aggressive are far higher. I mean, it's actually a very high-strung space where one feels often less free to express ideas than in a dive bar somewhere, right? A dive bar where you're supposed to have all these horrible reactionary middle Americans. I grew up in Ohio around these people. I've been in tons of these dive bars. So my response to that sort of thing, and maybe you can give yours as well, is to turn it around and say, okay, it appears that your vision of a liberated world is one where you would have none of these enclaves predicated on some kind of homogeneity tied to history, ancestry, religion, cultural continuity, that sort of thing. You see this as implicitly awful, or inherently awful, is what I mean. Just the mere fact that other people in the world would want to exist this way, even if it were voluntary. And so what your vision of liberated world actually is the spreading of your value system, your way of life over the entire planet. And a kind of a kind of global homogeneity in the way that you think is correct. And I see that as, first of all, inherently authoritarian. The idea that you're against free association, you're against organic self-formed communities. And I think that is actually the anti-authoritarian position, is to be okay with people associating the way that they please. And what your world domination anarchism consists of is what every utopian, ultimately authoritarian movement has been, which is believing that you have the correct way of life and it needs to be pushed on people. And if they're going to resist it, they need to be converted. If they resist conversion, they need to be re-educated. If they resist re-education, they need to be destroyed. And the second thing is, there's no way this could be done without a state. There's no way that you can manage people's behavior to this degree without some kind of administration, some kind of bureaucracy, some kind of surveillance, some kind of enforcement arm. And it's just never going to happen. And the problem here is the what Thomas Sowell called the unconstrained vision. You're familiar with this?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay, he talks about the conflict of visions, right? The sort of utopian perspective versus the tragic one. And in this case, this is the unconstrained vision being unleashed and able to run amok. And there's this kind of astonishing fantasy that we are going to spread modern far left values all over the world. And if people don't like them, then they're backward and they must be punished. And it's just an absolute recipe for disaster. It's completely unpragmatic and unstrategic to me. And it's ultimately unjust. I'm okay with the fact that all over the world, there are people who would hate me for my sexuality and think it's disgusting. Why do I need anyone's benediction? All I need is to be able to voluntarily associate with whom I like.
Mm. Yeah, I think that the word voluntary there is probably the most important one. Yesterday evening, after a little bit of discussion with you, I returned to something that I wrote many years ago during the time of my university studies, and came across and was reminded of the kind of crossfire between the camps of the libertarian right and the objectivists on exactly this issue. And the main thrust of the objectivist argument being that the libertarian right is too much of a big tent, and to the point where their idea of freedom is perhaps watered down in meaning, or perhaps even meaningless. And I have some sympathy for that idea, and that liberty, freedom needs to be, clearly defined so that you can know what steps to take to preserve it, and know what kind of warning signs are there that it's under threat. But there's a particular quote that I found from that. It's from Walter Block, who's a very prominent libertarian, and he says he's responding to Peter Schwartz, an objectivist, who says that like a Nazi saluting his swastika flag on his front lawn is like, just anathema, basically. And so Bloch says, quote, "Would Schwarz and the objectivists really incarcerate Nazis or communists who took no coercive actions whatsoever?" And I think that if people want to live in some kind of experiment where they live, from each according to his means, to each according to his needs kind of thing, and they do that voluntarily, and everyone involved is down with that, there is a sense in which nobody is really having their freedom curtailed. It's quite likely, based on what I believe about economics, for that experiment to be a failure and short-lived. But I think people should be free to try them. And the good thing about a patchwork quilt, such as you laid out in the last episode, where people are doing different experiments in different places, is that as they produce results and the people living in them are able to see them, there's actually is a kind of dialectic dynamic which lets people say, you know what, this isn't quite what I wanted. And that would probably, in many cases, give someone a push factor to go and leave and try and find something a little bit more refined to what they really were looking for in another place. And that sounds to me like a good result from that kind of experiment, that people learn a little bit from them and they move around a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's well put. And I need to add on to what I said before, because I was being a bit acidic about it. So it's a little bit like what you were touching on there is a little bit like the sort of thick versus thin libertarianism, right? Where you need to have it's not enough, right, to just say, well, these people are doing it voluntarily, right? You need to have a culture and an ethos that supports freedom, that supports respect for individual dignity, individual autonomy. And so to say, well, we have all these people, quote unquote, voluntarily associating in an organic community, and they're a bunch of literal neo-Nazis, not in the garbage way that people use that term to just mean anyone they don't like, but literal Nazis, right? And could that really be a voluntary organic community that people weren't being coerced to stay in, and that would leave others alone? And I'm not some pie in the sky utopian. I think in the scenario that I'm describing, you would get a lot of garbage communities and places where people wouldn't be happy and where there would be coercion within them. But I think getting that starting point where you just break up the worst Leviathan states would put us in such a better position to move toward increasing freedom. And these smaller communities would have much less coercive power, bureaucratic reach, much less ability to coerce the people within or around them. And you could have a kind of general movement toward increasing freedom. And as you said, if you have more ability for people to freely move and you start doing experiments in freedom where people can see different ways of living, because you will get some that are much better than others, that can lead by example and move us in the direction of an increasing shared culture of freedom, human dignity, and that sort of thing. And so I think the objection that I raised at the beginning is misplaced, in that I think what I'm describing here with pan-secessionism gives us the best opportunity strategically to move toward the kind of community that the objector wants. Does that make sense? Or is that a little long-winded?
Well, it makes sense, but I disagree. I don't think that is what the objector wants. I think that if they're truly honest with themselves, the objector does not want a patchwork, and they don't want decentralization of power. I've said this pretty much all along about the anarchists that most of them are just commies in disguise.
I think I'm like assuming best intentions of this person, right? Rather than that they're an ideologue. I'm assuming this person in their heart of hearts really wants human freedom and flourishing, rather than just
if they say that they want it and they actually do, yes, granted. But let's explore this from one further angle, which I kind of hinted at before, but let's take it more explicitly. Escape. Okay, if you imagine a 14-year-old girl living in a Nazi commune, okay, she in many ways is going to be, well, brainwashed, possibly under threat of all kinds of non-freedom things. Like, you know, let's not go into the gory details, but it's not a great, you know, living in a very patriarchal, brutish, anti-philosophical sort of Nordic hero worship cult is not a good place for a 14-year-old girl, in my opinion. And I think objectively too. But she has the chance of escape if she's brave enough and clever enough to work out that escape would be a good thing for her. And she, you know, manages to organize that escape. She can flee to somewhere else. But the fact is about the Leviathan that we live in now, there isn't really, it's incredibly difficult to escape from. And the kind of world that, because I don't have the good faith that you have about these American anarchists, the kind of world in which they would want to live in has no escape either. Because if you're not down with the values that they hold, and they do hold a lot of them, even implicitly, even the ones they kind of don't want to admit that they hold, if you don't like those values, where are you going to go if it's been spread out everywhere? And
in the sense that the one world vision is inherently totalitarian, no matter how benignly it's framed.
Yeah, because it's fundamentalist.
Yeah, sure.
If we have an objection to what they're saying, or a refinement, or we even raise a question like, you know, if there's a bunch of people that are living a certain way and they're not harming anybody else, and the overall level of harm in their community is much less than what they would be if they're living inside the Leviathan and wage slavery and tax farming and all the rest of it, is that not comparatively better? And if they come at you, and as they do, with you're a reactionary, you're a this, and a long list of things, that's a fundamentalist position, and therefore that's one of the main reasons why I don't take seriously that they actually want freedom. And in a lot of dialogue, to summarize hundreds of separate conversations that I had with a number of these kinds of people, both people who are just anonymous commenters and people who are kind of more established figures as well, it always came back to the idea of no, actually, when you really boil it down, what they want is no hierarchy. So it's not actually a philosophical thing. They're talking about ends. And that's why I just see them as kind of a certain kind of communist. That's how I've always seen it.
Now, what do you mean when you say it's not really a philosophical thing? You mean in the sense that there's no room?
Hierarchy is a result. If you want to, philosophy is saying, well, where are we now? Where do we want to go? Where do we not want to go? Looking at choices and considering them, the process of considering. But first of all, when you look at a result like no hierarchy, you run into this issue which people like Jordan Peterson have very well sort of critiqued and said, look, it doesn't matter how many different ways you want to cut this, like true equality of outcome is impossible, absolutely impossible.
Right, but Jordan Peterson, he does a Mott and Bailey fallacy with it, because what he says is any, as soon as you have values,
what is a Mott and Bailey?
A Mott and Bailey fallacy is where you defend a difficult to defend controversial point by defending a weaker version of it, like a more common sense version that is easy to defend, and then you switch it as if you've defended the harder one. So if that didn't make sense, it'll make sense when I explain it with Peterson. So I agree with Peterson that there's no way to have full egalitarianism because people just differ in ability, any ability. So as soon as you have any value system, or any value at all, whether it's intelligence or athleticism or generosity or anything, you're immediately going to have a ranking of the people in any group because everyone's better at different things. So, but he leaps from that to then using that to defend basically the system that we have and say,
yes, I agree, but that's not the part I was referring to. I was saying that
sure.
his initial critique and saying, look, this is exactly why equality of outcome is not possible. That applies to hierarchy too, because okay, so if you take a kind of, there are different conceptions of the world in which this would be. So in a right libertarian sort of anarcho-capitalist condition, they would make the claim, well, there's no one has the governmental monopoly power, therefore there's no hierarchy. Everyone's on the same level playing field. And I don't buy that because I don't believe in Homo economicus and the idea that we have to, or that we even should operate in this way. And I think that whichever point you start it, unless everybody is literally starting from like a kind of Pol Pot, naked in the paddy fields, none of us have anything, returned to primitivity. And even then, the sort of different levels of trauma on people's minds will determine some kind of hierarchy of ability to function. Wherever you start this experiment, it's not equal. So it's not going to lead to equal. Right. And then, similarly, the left libertarian idea of, well, if we have no governments and we take every single part of this imagined patriarchy and get rid of it, and somehow then, regardless of all these different things, we'll all be on the same level. Not only, as you said before, would that require a state, but even if somehow there was a magic power that enabled it to come about without state power, it wouldn't look anything remotely like non-hierarchy.
You mean because of inherent differences in ability that would change things immediately? Right. So
and levels of trauma.
Sorry, I missed that.
And levels of trauma.
Okay, sure. Yeah. I mean, I think maybe the point that we're driving toward, if I can kind of bring us back, is trying to impose any one of these systems on the entire planet is utopian, dangerous, would never lead to the outcome that the people want, that the ideologues want, right? And therefore, to me, the most reasonable strategy is to try to do this voluntary association to local or regional autarky, to community self-defense, to secession. And that's a messy big picture thing. And it would only, I'm selling a completely tragic vision. It's, for it to work, it's going to be totally ugly, messy, unfair in various ways, but I think it's the best chance we have.
Good. Well, let's leave that dangling for the viewer, and then they can say what they think about it.
They can say, I knew Bellamy Fitzpatrick was a white nationalist. Look at those blue eyes.
Yeah. That's why I keep my hat on, so they don't see my blonde hair.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Nothing to do with the fact that it's 1 degree above zero outside. So we touched on in the end of the last episode, we touched on the idea that for this kind of idea to have any traction, there was a big obstacle to overcome, which I see, and I think you do too a little bit, as like a spiritual problem, in that so many of these different groups see one another as somehow less human or evil or the ultimate enemy. And this takes their sight off the sort of present enemy of the Leviathan. And it also, it's going to be present in all relations between these groups and between individuals until it's somehow resolved or dispelled or something. Did you have any sort of optimistic ideas of what could be done to sort of overcome this obstacle a little bit in spiritual terms?
Well, no, not at the moment. I mean, I think that's part of what I'm trying to do with this project, is that I would like us to, with this project, try to talk to as wide ideologically an array of people who even have the slightest interest in a pan-secessionist idea, and who are genuinely against a world state, who not people who just want to get rid of the one that we have now to create their own, but who are actually open to this and just start sowing seeds out there and seeing if we can get this kind of conversation going in as many different camps as possible. The biggest problem that we have is, as you were saying, that these different groups, they hate each other. They hate their cultural enemies more than they hate the power elite, which is the oldest game in the book, and it's completely designed that way. Social media encourages it. The mainstream media encourage it, and it's pretty easy to get people to hate. It's really easy to get people to hate.
I take some encouragement in the movie from like last year or the year before, produced by Mike Cernovich, called Hoaxed.
Right.
There is
I was supposed to watch that, and I haven't.
Yeah, well, if you the viewer haven't seen it, I think it's one of the best documentaries ever made. It's a very, very illuminating picture on just how mass media and the power elite work together to shape people's way they look at the world, and create and create media hoaxes. There's a section where they're talking to this guy who's like a regional organizer for Black Lives Matter, and he's representing a big city. I don't know if it's New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, one of those kind of size cities. So he's a big organizer with a lot of people behind him. And the filmmakers are in conversation with him. And first of all, they sort of very, very gently ask him if he's aware of certain nuanced facts about some of the cases that he's protesting. Like, I don't know any of the I don't remember any of the details of these cases, but let's just say that in one case, there was a black young man fatally shot by white police officers, and they're presenting this in their organization and in their outreach as a murder and all the rest of it. And then one of the facts that's being presented is, oh, well, do you know that he had just robbed 7 houses at gunpoint himself? This kind of thing. And he's kind of like, oh, I didn't know that. And then they present a number of these ideas to him just to see how he reacts. And then they talk to him about a time that he went to, I think, Washington, D.C., and his protest was right next to a MAGA rally. And, there was this tension and what was going to happen and this kind of thing. And then the Trump supporters invited him and his cohorts onto the stage and said, would you like to speak? And the man himself sort of says that he thought very carefully about what he was going to say. He realized that this was a very important moment. Mm-hmm. And he came out with a unifying message that said, look, we have our ideas and we have our perceived injustices that we're trying to highlight. And you guys have, your vision. And there's no reason for us to necessarily hate each other. And he said that he felt inspired by God to say these things. And then there's like footage of these two very different groups mixing, having a good time, having a beer together and some food and a hot dog or whatever. And of course, the point of this being presented in this documentary about the news is this went completely unreported. Because that doesn't fit the narrative. They want this division. And so I think that the message that I would want to put across at this point is whoever you are and whoever you encounter, try to find some common ground with people, even if you find that you disagree with them a lot. Because I have no illusions that the the Black Lives Matter guys went away just thinking, well, you know what? Well, this Trump guy, he's fantastic. It wasn't an instant conversion by either party, but they, in their commingling, they clearly went away with a better opinion of each other.
Right. I mean, so there are a lot of different ways we could go with that. I guess I do have some optimism. So for people who haven't seen or read my other media, or listened to or read my other media, one of the things I'm very concerned about is technology, and I'm sure we'll talk about that at length at some point, and the effects that technology is having on the ecology, the human mind, the human body. But I have come to appreciate in the past few years that one major upshot of the internet is that it is causing a crisis of credibility for the old established mainstream media organs. That is a positive thing, but the danger coming from that, it's a danger full of potential, but the danger is that I think people are getting more and more cordoned off. And so rather than having one or two or three big narratives that everyone believes in, now we have hundreds of small narratives that everyone believes in. And so there's just as much, you can get just as badly informed through this proliferation of media opportunities, but there's at least an opportunity for getting better information, and in some ways getting cordoned off opens up the possibility for these organic voluntary communities to form, because you can find people who want to live the way that you want to live in free association with each other. But it's a huge task to try to actually open up the dialogue necessary for this kind of big picture strategy to form. And that's what we're going to be exploring with the show. That's what I want to explore with the show.
Yeah, definitely.
So, but was there a direction you wanted to go to get into the spirituality issue?
Well, I think that the logical question is, I was going to just pose generally the question, what reasons can we offer our viewers for exploring spirituality in general, the benefits to themselves and to the communities? So I think that the obvious connection there is that when we're talking about these very different groups, maybe we start with the question of, what do we have in common spiritually?
Do you want to start that off?
I mean, I've been writing a lot from a very sort of unfamiliar angle to me about this lately, and I think that it comes down to something that sounds as cheesy as like how people need a sense of belonging, and they need love, and these aren't economic or philosophical or political considerations. These are fundamental to who we are, and it's something that even like some of the worst people, like there are some really awful people out there whose actions are completely abominable. Mm-hmm. Those people probably ended up that way because they didn't find the place that they could be where they were accepted and loved for who they were before they became abominable. So it's a very, very rough sketch, zoomed out, low resolution picture, but it's kind of at the center of everything that I'm ticking over when I'm thinking about these issues right now.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that's a complicated question. I don't know. I haven't read enough to know about whether there are these just sort of born human predators who are just sociopathic from the get-go, or whether there's an opportunity, some kind of critical developmental period where that can be overcome through receiving love and community. But yeah, I mean, I generally agree with what you're saying. I mean, I guess what's attractive to me about the very small scale Dunbar's number size communities is there's a way of dealing with people that you think that you could just never get along with. And if you can't give them love and community because you find there are irreconcilable differences between each other, at least you can give them a certain level of respect. And the respect basically being non-aggression, non-interference. And it's a way to just dial down the level of animosity and violence in the world that comes from this kind of forced integration through globalism of people who can never get along because of cultural differences and therefore are divided and conquered by the power elite. And I think there is something inherently spiritually and existentially fulfilling just about this idea of decreasing overall hatred, violence, human coercion, because ultimately, you know, whether you like it or not, I'm convinced that these ancient non-dualist esoteric tendencies that we find in spiritual and religious traditions the world over, whether it's Vedanta or Neoplatonism, these ideas that we are essentially united at the ground of being are true. And it sounds cheesy, and it's like, oh, you guys are hippies, and you know, all these kind of boilerplate crap arguments that I know some people in the audience are having right now in their minds, and I'm sure we'll get it in the comments section. But you know, when you throw hatred and animosity and violence out into the world, it ultimately all circulates back to you. And I'm not convinced that we can have a, you know, one world peaceful get along society. I'm not. So then the only thing to do is break it up. Break it up, Bolo'bolo style. The book Bolo'bolo. I think there are flaws with it, but maybe we can talk about that book on an episode. Maybe we could do a report back. There are flaws in it, but the overall vision is pretty fucking good.
I think that another thing I've been thinking about, and I think this has been the case ever since I sort of made a conscious decision to withdraw from a sort of cultural warrior role, is that although I wouldn't argue against your vision of pan-secessionism as an end state, I think it's very attractive. It's something that I used to write a lot about, the desire to live in an enclave and everything that goes with it, how the life ways within such places are hugely preferable to what we have.
Intimacy, real human intimacy.
Yeah, and belonging, and like all the specific things that are wrong, people can have a chance to think, well, how are we going to do it? So, you know, the trauma of childbirth and hospitals and bad parenting and child abuse, which is the start of all our lives, can be replaced by truly loving, you know, peaceful parenting, for example. And so my only, not reservation, a question that I have is, for this foreseeable future, for this immediate period of my life, I'm not really in any position to start that very easily. I was looking for people to start those kind of projects with a while back, but I feel myself right now more drawn to a sort of parallel construction, a parallel initiative or effort whereby while the civilization around us sort of slowly collapses, psychologically, economically, ecologically, to try to be someone whose calling, if you like, is to try to put out as many messages of a shared origin, as many sort of universal, peaceful, loving ideas as possible as I can, in both a kind of the way in which I live my life, but also in writings and things like this. And I guess maybe I'd like to hear from, if there's anyone watching this that feels that that is also something that they feel more drawn to doing, that, like right now, than to start thinking about how they might transform their lives towards a patchwork quilt of pan-secessionism. So not to stand in the way of your idea at all. I'm largely supportive, but this is something that I would like to explore. This sort of, it's very cheesy. It's very sort of love is all you need. But I want to see how far I can get with it, and how far we as humanity can get with it while we go through this period. Let's just assume the patchwork quilt is not only possible, but that it's going to happen. Mm-hmm. We've got this messy period now where things are in decline. And as you said, I think last episode, a crisis point would be a good point for people to really take practical considerations towards forming these things.
Well, I mean, I think we're in the crisis point.
Yeah. And so equipping people, as many people as I can, with the consideration, like, just remember, when you get there, your neighbor is not some kind of demon. There are some common spiritual connections here. Maybe that's also helpful.
Yeah, I think it is. I don't see any kind of contradiction in it, because, as I was saying, one of the biggest issues is psychological. It's ideological. It's even getting people to the point that they feel like they could first tolerate the mere existence of people with values very different from themselves, just knowing that they're out there somewhere living that way. Like, some people are not even there. Like, just knowing somewhere, that someone's saying something I don't like, or having sex in a way that I don't like I'm having trouble even with that. Then, like, the next level down is, could I ever countenance some kind of dialogue with this person? Okay. Could I possibly consider a large-scale political project, right? So, there are tiers that have to be overcome, and I think putting out that, love is all you need, sheets of LSD raining from the sky message is not a bad one, because it's just trying to create some fertile psychological soil for even conceiving of an idea like this. I mean that, obviously there's a reason that this strategy I'm putting out has not worked for centuries, right? I mean that's not fair. Like, there've always been these dropout communities, but on a large scale, it's never succeeded, unless you count these periods of immediately post-civilization collapse, right? Then usually what happens is a fracturing and the creation of many small communities, but they never last. So yeah, the last part of this is the ecological question, and that's one that's always been a big concern of mine. It's actually the way that I got, as we talked about in episode 0, unless I cut it out. That's the way I got interested in politics and philosophy in the first place, was at a young age realizing that we were doing so much harm to the biosphere, and eventually, as I matured a bit, realizing it didn't seem like it was ever going to stop. And so part of the vision I'm trying to lay out here as well is that one of the dangers of the quasi world society that we already live in that is converging more and more toward a world society is the incredible levels of energy consumption and topsoil loss, deforestation, deteriorating food quality. Food quality is much worse than it was even a century ago because of the degradation of the soils. And so part of the vision here, I think, has to be a fundamental reorientation toward of the human relationship toward the biosphere. And I think it has to be one that is converging toward a harmonization of needs. I think there are a lot of different perspectives on what that could be. Of course, there's this sort of green high-tech route of which I am skeptical. Although I think it hypothetically it could be better than what we have now, depending on how it's done. There's a kind of, on the other hand, an extreme primitivist sort of perspective that is known in the anarchist subculture and in some sections of a sort of far right primitivism. And I understand the appeal of that perspective. I don't see it as a viable strategic route for a whole host of reasons that perhaps we can talk about. But what I do see a lot of potential in is the design systems coming out of permaculture, the techniques of forest gardening, where there is a way of doing a broader scale, lower intensity form of management, and also the potential to actually restore soils relatively quickly on a large scale through things like mob stock grazing and combined with polycultural agroforestry, where you move groups of domesticated grazing animals quickly through areas at a high density, and you can build soil quite rapidly. You can sequester CO2 through doing this kind of technique, for those of us who are not anthropogenic climate change skeptics. And there is a way, I believe, to, through very local food autarky, restore a relationship to the world that is sort of living in the garden again, so to speak. And I think there are ecological benefits to this. I think there are spiritual benefits to this. I think there are benefits to just human agency, human empowerment, being able to feed yourself from where you are with the people with whom you live gives you a type of political freedom and ability to exist in a autarkic, uncoerced, a type of independence that is the necessary component for this kind of state of non-interference and mutual respect among different communities.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. One thing that has occurred to me is that in all of my explorations into the sort of, I don't know what you might call it, mainstream permaculture world, I don't know if you remember any of my writings or
I do.
Podcasts about this. I found that it's a very sort of capitalized area, and there's almost like a pyramid scheme for these permaculture design certificate courses and things like that. And the overall conclusion that I came to in my mind, I don't know if I ever really shared it in a piece of writing, was that you have to have a vision for yourself and preferably people to do it with before you get into those kind of things, because in trying to kind of find people to work with through just going along to sort of permaculture events and so forth, you're more than likely to run into people who've just kind of missed the point. They're not even really considering the emancipatory angle. They're more like sort of thinking, oh, well, I don't have to go to Walmart anymore. It's like, okay, but is that it for you? A very, very minimalist, dipping their toes into it kind of thing. I just wondered from your experience, I don't think it's something that we've really talked about too much, because we've kind of talked about ideas more than your particular path through it. So ever since you advanced down this road with your current land project, I know you've been to some courses and you've mixed with some people. What kind of response have you had, and what kind of encounters and discussions have you been having about this?
Well, I guess this is where things go a lot when I talk to radicals about permaculture. It often very quickly goes to this place of, well, the kind of people who are into that, they're not that politically radical. Yes and no. I mean, you'll get a mixed bag of people, but it's really, to me, it's somewhat beside the point. Now, I don't mean to shut you down. I can answer your question once I make this point. It doesn't really matter whether the people who are in the North American permaculture milieu as it exists today are for the kinds of things that we're talking about on this video cast. It's about the design system, and it's about the techniques, and they can be employed in any sort of way. So this idea, I've gotten this pushback from anarchists a lot, that it's as if somehow we shouldn't be interested in this design system or these sets of techniques simply because the people who are drawn to them aren't radical. It doesn't matter. I mean, you can do anything with them, right?
I guess the angle I was trying to
get question. Okay, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, just to make sure we understand each other. It was not so much like, why should you do these things? It was more like, in doing these things, have you had a different experience to me? Have you found that there are people who are sort of more on your wavelength, I guess is an easy way of saying it?
Some. Yes, some. It is I think you get a whole range of people, from sort of green capitalist type of person who is interested in learning about it, to have some kind of boutique business, whatever, which to some extent, it's, in many cases, it's better than if they were doing something else. So I don't even necessarily have a problem with that. I mean, everyone has to make money somehow. My problem with it is when people think that's the end point, right? Right. And then you get people who are sort of, doomist prepper type of people. Mm-hmm. And then you get people who are doing it for more out of the mainstream political reasons, who may be turned on to varying degrees. But honestly, for me, my entire life, any milieu or group I've belonged to, I find that I disagree with the majority no matter where I go. So it's not really a problem for me. So
Groucho Marx.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. Do you have further thoughts on this?
Not really. I mean, I think that we've done enough in broad strokes to explain to people why the ecological angle is an important thing. I think I would like to finish by perhaps responding to your comment that you don't really seem to care that much if they're doing it. The important thing is that they're doing it. And I think I would like to stress how...
Wait, I don't understand.
People who are doing permaculture but have no interest in critiques of Leviathan or spirituality or anything else.
Oh, no, it's not.
You were saying like that you're missing the point. You're happy that they're doing it anyway, right?
No, what I was saying was it doesn't. I was saying a lot of people in the anarchist world have written to me or said to me in person, I don't know why you're so into this permaculture thing. These people are just sort of, light green left liberals.
Mm-hmm.
Why should we
Yeah.
care about this? And my point was, no, you can do anything with this design model and these techniques. Just because a lot of the people who are interested in this aren't, fully turned on anarchist radicals, doesn't mean that the design system and the techniques are not themselves interesting, because they can be put toward any end that you want once you learn them. And so the idea now it's a logical fallacy, right? Like, oh well, boring people are doing that, therefore this thing is boring. No.
Okay.
Right.
So I kind of missed that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't have any more angles on that. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to ask me about.
Well, yeah, I guess I just wanted to turn the question around on you. I sort of gave my spiel about ecology and why I think it's relevant, and I was wondering if you had anything to add or put your own spin on, or if you had any criticisms of what I was giving. I mean, all this is broad strokes, right? And then we'll drill down in future episodes.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I could add would be that since in the time that you've known me, I've gone from someone that's being like more interested in the politics, a little bit interested in the anti-civ critique, to being someone that was mostly interested in the anti-civ critique. The politics fell away a bit. And as I've explored other dimensions like psychology and spirituality, I guess I haven't remained as focused on the ecological concerns. And I think that although I do things in my own life based on those kinds of choices, like, not eating dairy, for example. I mean, it's not the only reason I don't eat dairy for ecological angle. I've kind of become more pragmatic in my approach to these things because I don't really at this time have much opportunity to do much else. So I guess I could summarize by saying that I guess I kind of typify and I empathize with the kind of person who's like, I'm concerned about these things, but I'm not sure there's a whole lot else I can do right now. I suppose except by dialogue, by sharing the ideas. And so I'll always join in with that when it's kind of brought up. And it is a little bit more here and there. I bump into someone who says to me, have you seen Cowspiracy or something like this,
Yeah, maybe that's enough for now. I wanted to just put one last point on what you said. Some people who know me from my previous media projects might think, oh, Bellamy's not pushing the whole green anarchist critique as much as maybe they were expecting. And it's not that I don't have those feelings. It's that, as you said, I am attempting what most people wouldn't think is a pragmatic view, but to me is a relatively pragmatic view of wanting to try to think about big picture strategy more than I used to, whereas before it was more just put the hardest knife edge critique out there of everything, and instead okay, what is sort of more conceivable than just everyone becomes a total raging green anarchist.
Mm-hmm.
right. So
yeah, good.
Thank you for watching episode 3 of Liberty and Logos. We're going to, in future episodes, start trying to bring others in the conversation, and getting more maybe less big picture, more specific, and please consider subscribing to our channel. Please give us some comments, some emails. We would love to hear feedback. This is the first experimental dump of episodes, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much.